Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're recording on a Tuesday, unusually. It's been a public holiday here, so we're recording on Tuesday, the 8th of October. So I'm sure lots will happen between now and when we get it out, but that's why. So how have you been, Jen? What have you been up to?
Well, I excitedly have been in Tamworth for the weekend, so far away from the ocean, but I did get to see the Golden Guitar for the first time. I'm not a country music fan, by the way. It was for family. But I've been up to that, just in case you're interested. I had a piece in The Australian, more related to this podcast. I had a piece in The Australian last week talking about what should Australia be learning from the increasing conflict between Iran and Israel. And it really just talked about preparedness and the need for Australia to really grapple with the fact that we may well be in a conflict ourselves, and what does that mean? And then I had a piece in the WA Defence Review, which came out on the 1st of October, which you can find online. It talks about, it basically just provides a summary of what happened with the Surface Combatant Fleet Review and what that means for the Royal Australian Navy. So you can find that online, or you can find that on my website. What have you been up to, Richard?
I've not been up to anything that's that exciting, I'm afraid. I'm busy with teaching, but we're going to move on and start talking about what's happening in the region. And right. Starting off, I guess, with the big story that everyone's been talking about. So do you want to crack us up, start off?
Sure. So look, I guess some sad news for the Royal New Zealand Navy. So on Saturday night, it became clear that the crew of HMNZS Manawanui, which is effectively a hydrographic dive vessel, had to abandon ship. So 75 personnel all safely abandoned ship, had to be recovered in Samoa. Now, the rescue effort doesn't seem like it was particularly straightforward. The weather looks like it was pretty bad. The ship has since sunk. It sunk on Sunday morning, having caught fire first. And so it's certainly been splashed all over the news in terms of what has happened with this. It was reported to be the first sinking of a New Zealand Navy ship since World War II. And it has a significant impact on the New Zealand Navy's capability. As much as in Australia we tend to think of the New Zealand Navy as akin to us, it's actually only about 2,000 people strong. Until Saturday, they only actually had 9 commissioned vessels. That is now down to 8. And when it comes to their diving and hydrography capability, Manawanui was it. So it's a pretty significant event. Thankfully that everybody was safely rescued. And obviously a very difficult decision, I suspect, by the commanding officer to abandon ship. But it has had and will continue to have wider implications on the New Zealand Navy. What are your thoughts on the sinking of Manawanui?
Obviously it's a big deal in a lot of ways. In terms of capability, it's a big deal, as you say. Really important sort of specialised capability, but more generally, the New Zealand Navy is not. I think it's fair to say is not in amazing shape at the moment. I think they're now down to 8 vessels, of which I think only 5 are in commission or in active service, but largely because of personnel shortages. So whether or not that will now change is difficult to tell. But they've been going through a really hard period, and I think that we really don't know very much about what happened as of yet, and I will leave any kind of ship driving discussions to yourself, but there has been some reports coming out about loss of power, but it's quite clear there's going to be a wider sort of inquiry, and I suspect that's going to shed further light on a range of difficult issues, frankly, for the New Zealand Defence Force in terms of sort of everything from personnel and personnel shortages to questions around sort of maintenance and kit and all sorts of other things. So in that regard, I think it's a sort of a difficult and frankly going to be sort of embarrassing in and of itself, but it's also going to shed light on a range of issues that I think are there and most people acknowledge. And then there's a whole range of other sort of issues. This obviously has happened off the coast of Samoa. There's still quite a lot of fuel on board, amongst other things. So there's potential significant environmental consequences, and the New Zealand government has already indicated that they're going to try and do what they can to mitigate those. But in terms of sort of reputation and everything like that, it's not great. I think is the honest conclusion from a range of different points of view.
No, it's not. And I think, look, we don't know what has happened. Very clearly, the vessel's taken on a lot of water, and I would suspect that there has been a loss of power potentially prior to that. But again, we really don't know. But I think it does ask a lot of questions, unfortunately, about the New Zealand Navy. So if you think about funding into the New Zealand Defence Force in general, so last financial year, the New Zealand Defence Force received 1% of GDP. So if you think about Australian defence funding, of course, Australia is a lot bigger, but percentage of GDP is kind of a relative measure to compare countries' spending. Australia is about 2.1% of GDP. When you think about the New Zealand defence budget, I think it was about $5 billion. So about 10% of the Australian defence budget last financial year. This financial year, controversially, the New Zealand Defence Force has actually taken a series of cuts. Now, how much that cut is not entirely clear. It's probably about 7%, but it's gone down to about 0.9%. So it's expected to be about 0.9% of New Zealand GDP this year. Now, that is a significant challenge. We know that the New Zealand Defence Force's capabilities are ageing. When we think about the 8 ships they have left, they operate 2 Anzac-class frigates that did go through upgrades in Canada, controversially not Australia, in 2020 and 2022, but will be needing to be replaced. I mean, we know the impacts that we're having on the Australian Navy Anzac-class ships and their sustainment. And if you think about the New Zealand Navy Anzac-class ships, where they've got 2, they've probably used them much more. They'd be having at least the same issues, if not worse. They now only have 2 offshore patrol vessels, 2 inshore patrol vessels, and there's rumours that a number of those are laid up due to workforce issues. They've got, of course, Aotearoa, who is providing replenishment, also replenishment for the Australian Navy at the moment, and then the multi-role vessel Canterbury, which is kind of their amphibious capability. Much of that capability is actually significantly ageing and will need to be replaced in the near future, which will be expensive. In terms of the New Zealand Navy and its workforce issues, there is lots of reporting of issues around pay, etc. And the government had recently announced an initiative, I can't remember how much it was, maybe $500 million, to try and address some of the paying conditions. But they did that concurrently with making an announcement that the non-uniform parts of the New Zealand Department of Defence would experience workforce cuts, and they asked for voluntary redundancies. And that, I think it's about 3,000 civilians in their department, is being cut quite substantially. So, look, there will be a lot of questions asked about whether the lack of investment has led to issues with maintenance, etc., on this platform.
So, what else has been going on? Significant exercises taking place, most notably exercise Malabar.
Sure. Look, there's been lots of exercises. In fact, look, if somebody was going to do the analysis, I'd have to say there's probably been quite an uptick in exercises that the Royal Australian Navy is participating in. I'm not sure whether that bears itself out in the analysis, but, just recently we've seen the MMCA, we've seen Perth's visit to Cambodia, they've done a bunch of things. We've seen Sydney do a bunch of things around North Asia and Southeast Asia, and now we see Exercise Malabar. So Exercise Malabar is a quadrilateral exercise between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. It commenced in 1992, but that was a bilateral exercise between the US and India. Australia and Japan were first invited, I think it was about 2007, linked in with the forming of the Quad. Unfortunately, in about 2008, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and rumoured to be after protestations from China about the Quad and Exercise Malabar, pulled Australia effectively out of the Quad and out of Exercise Malabar. From about 2015-ish onwards, Australia's been fighting pretty hard to get back into Exercise Malabar, but India wasn't so keen because of those early issues. But they rejoined in 2020, and we actually saw in 2023 Exercise Malabar being conducted off Australia in the East Coast exercise areas. So that's pretty significant message. So this year it'll be conducted off Vishakhapatnam in India. HMNZS Stewart is participating from the Royal Australian Navy and representatives from the other 3 countries. Exactly what's happening is not clear. The reporting says it's going to be the most complex Malabar ever, but I note that every press release about every exercise always says it's the most complex and the highest interoperability or something like that. Certainly some surface warfare, reportedly some anti-submarine warfare. I did see one random report on an Indian website that said also involving special forces. I find that highly unlikely, to be honest. But yeah, that's kind of Exercise Malabar.
Yep.
Any comments on Exercise Malabar?
No, I think there's also the bit of a focus on ASW. There's reports that the Indians are involving a submarine, and as seemingly quite often at the moment with the Quad, or certainly 3 elements of the Quad, there's a bit of P8 diplomacy going on. So the Indians and the Americans certainly are sending P8s or involving P8s. I don't know if any RAAF P8s are going. I've not seen any reference, but that side of things is something where we've seen quite a lot of those kind of connections using the same platform, and it seems to be an area where they see they can have quite a lot of useful engagement and development there. So I would not be at all surprised to see a little bit of an ASW focus within it as well.
And I think that's quite interesting in itself. I'm pretty sure Malabar 2023 had a submarine, but certainly Exercise AusIndex, which is the bilateral exercise between Australia and India, which commenced in 2015, took place off the coast of Australia, off Western Australia last year, with an Indian submarine involved. I'm not sure if there was an Australian one or not. But it is interesting because I wouldn't have thought 10 years ago when I was planning Exercise AusIndex, the inaugural Exercise AusIndex, that we would be increasingly conducting anti-submarine warfare operations with India. Of course, it becomes a space quite quickly that has a lot of classification associated with it, normally something only done, honestly, with the closest of partners. So I think that is significant in itself.
Yeah, definitely. It speaks both to the strength of or growing strength of those connections, but also the sense of sort of perceived, almost shared threat and concern about potential Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean, which is clearly something that the Indians are very concerned about and fits into sort of the wider Australian, American, etc. concerns. So I think there's not really notable shift.
No, I agree. Now, Malabar's not the only exercise, though. We have to give a shout out to Exercise Bersama Lima. Can't believe I said that wrong. I used to plan that exercise, which is occurring, it says, in Singapore and Malaysia, but it'll be off the coast of Malaysia in the Malaysian EEZ. And it is an annual 5-power defence agreement exercise. Interesting, Australia doesn't seem to be sending a ship this year. It looks like a P8 has deployed, and that's probably the P8 normally that's operating out of Butterworth, and an RAN clearance diving team, which is positive and a pretty common thing for Exercise Bersama Lima. Now, when we get to the Did You Know section, which we're going to bring back today, we will talk a little bit about the 5-power defence agreement. I think it's something that's often forgotten about or often misunderstood, particularly when we talk about Australia's relationship with Malaysia. I think commentators are quick to say that Australia and Malaysia don't have a very strong relationship and overlook the fact that we have permanent army and I'm pretty sure Air Force forces based at the Malaysian base in Butterworth, and we are part of the five-power defence agreement with Malaysia. So it is closer than people say. Richie, any comments on exercise Osama Lima?
No, nothing from me on that one. I'm going to pivot and go off to the Red Sea, which we talk about quite a lot. So sort of continued activity by the Houthis. They have struck another vessel, a Panama-flagged tanker, the Cordelia Moon. This was there were a number of missiles launched at the tanker, and then it appears to have been actually struck by a USV of some form. And so sort of some damage has been done, although it appears that the vessel is still operating and is not at risk. There have been other attacks on other merchant vessels and further sort of missile launches which have been intercepted by US vessels. So I guess the story here is one of kind of continuity, right? This is something that's been happening for a long time. It got a lot of attention early on and is getting, frankly, less and less attention, but is still requiring the same kind of level of naval involvement just to kind of maintain status quo, which is, I think, all we can really expect the naval forces to be doing at this point. And it's absorbing quite a lot of capacity, and even down to things like burning through missile stocks. So the Americans are using quite a lot of missiles in the Red Sea at the moment, which, considering production is not always quite what people would like. These are ongoing kind of issues.
Yeah, and there's certainly some lessons for the Royal Australian Navy, despite the fact that we have declined to send a ship.
You can't avoid this, can you?
In case you haven't heard that, I've written a bit on it about magazine depth and issues about resupply at sea, etc., which we have talked to death about. I think it is a really interesting one, this Red Sea business. There's a lot that's come out in the last couple of weeks about it. Not only have we seen the kind of renewed attacks, so last week, as you mentioned, we saw the 2 attacks. Prior to that, we actually hadn't seen the Houthis attack a merchant ship since the 2nd of September. They had, of course, been lobbing a significant number of missiles into Israel with limited to no effect, but hadn't been so focused on merchant shipping. But what we did see, and it probably is just over 2 weeks ago, the details on it aren't entirely clear. But it does look like the Houthis have tried to launch a pretty significant barrage against a task group of American ships that were heading through the Bab el-Mandeb. Haven't seen much reporting from the US about it, except confirmation that the US ships did intercept about half a dozen ballistic missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles and 2 drones that were specifically targeted at US ships. We have seen that from time to time, but we hadn't necessarily seen that in that magnitude. And I think, sometimes we talk about the Houthi capability, it does seem like they don't have a lot of ability to launch salvos of missiles. So when we see them attack Israel with a ballistic missile, it's normally 1. When we see them attack ships, it's maybe 1 to 2. So that seems to be quite a intense barrage, different to the norm against the US ships transiting the Bab el-Mandeb. But again, apart from the fact that they were all shot down, we don't have a lot of details from the US on that. There has been some interesting reporting as well from Kurt Campbell from the US Department of Defense, who's focused on the Indo-Pacific, that says that actually the US had gone out of their way to try and engage China in the naval operations protecting shipping through the region, and that China had declined, and that their approach had been to signal to the Houthis where their ships were and don't attack Chinese ships. We did actually see, I think it may have been early this year, losing track now as we're unfortunately approaching nearly the 12-month anniversary of the seizure of the Galaxy Leader on the 19th of November 2023, and that was the ship that the Houthis seized and is still in the port of Fujairah as we speak. There was some reporting early on that the Houthis had said, if you are a Chinese or a Russian ship, identify yourself as such and we won't attack you. So there probably is certainly some truth to Kurt Campbell's comments there. And we have also seen, whilst all of this is happening, Australia has finally taken command of Task Force 153. How many Australians? It's not entirely clear. What they're doing, to be honest, it's not entirely clear what Operation Prosperity Guardian under Task Force 153 of the Combined Maritime Forces is doing. But I think it'll be a challenging task without any Australian assets. Any more thoughts on the Red Sea?
No, yeah, we've talked about it at length. I think that it's an issue which is not looking likely to go away anytime soon, and the more it gets drawn into wider issues in the Middle East, the more problematic that is likely to become. So I think it's going to be a recurring theme on this podcast going forward.
I think so, and I think we're nowhere near seeing a ceasefire resolution with any of the multiple fronts over there at the moment. And I think it is probably worth noting. So we saw last week on Tuesday the 1st of October, we saw Iran launch 180 missiles against Israel. Not really the focus of our podcast, except to say that the US did station and have increased their ships there, which is having a dramatic impact on the US availability of ships in Indo-PACOM, to be honest. But we saw 2 US destroyers shooting down a number of the Iranian missiles. So there is quite a draw on the US fleet from. We also saw last week a US Arleigh Burke launch or support an attack against the Houthis, I think over the weekend, with a bunch of Tomahawk missiles. So we are seeing a lot of pressure on the US Navy in the region, and that's got to be having an impact on their availability to support operations in the Indo-Pacific.
Yep. The Middle East is the place that you always talk about pulling out from and never quite manage. Moving to something else that we talk about a lot on this podcast, South China Sea. Normally we talk about this in reference to clashes, or have recently clashes between the Philippines and China. There was earlier on, or about a week ago, a incident between Vietnamese fishermen and Chinese vessels, in which Vietnamese fishing boats that were operating near the Paracel Islands, which were obviously claimed by both Vietnam and China, were attacked by what are reported to be Chinese state vessels and people, including sort of attacks with quite significant kind of weapons, not guns, but things like iron bars, crowbars, pipes, these sorts of things. So yeah, pretty nasty, pretty aggressive kind of action against the Vietnamese fishing boats operating in these kind of contested waters. So it's interesting just to see this occurring because, as I say, so much of the focus has been on the Philippines, and the Vietnamese clearly have some very, very strong views on these issues and have done for a long time, but tends to be much more kind of below the radar. So this was a pretty significant step up, both in terms of what seems to have happened and in terms of the publicity given to it.
It is, and I do wonder if it will influence Vietnam's policy on these issues going forward. As much as Vietnam does stand up to China on these issues, they do have a very different approach to the Philippines' assertive transparency campaign, and at times have, at least behind closed doors, been critical of the Philippines' approach and in ASEAN. And in fact, there's a key ASEAN meeting this week. We'll see if anything comes with it on these issues. So I think sometimes we do overlook what is happening between China and Vietnam. In fact, the most significant naval battles that have been fought over the Paracels and the Spratlys have in fact been between China and Vietnam. And when we talk about the Paracels, which often there is a more focus on the Spratly Islands, so the Paracels, I think about 300 and so kilometers south of Hainan Island, and about 360 kilometers maybe at most east of Vietnam. There was a pretty significant battle between China and Vietnam in 1974, the South Vietnam at the time, the Battle of the Paracel Islands, which effectively Vietnam was defeated, significant loss of life. So I think about 75 Vietnamese sailors and soldiers were killed in this battle. So it's a pretty significant. And since then, China has had control of the Paracels, although, of course, their sovereignty is disputed, as you mentioned. This seems like some pretty heavy-handed attempts at law enforcement, which I think just supports that wider policy that although this action was certainly in the details doesn't look like it would have been a strategic action or directed from the top, there is clearly a policy that pushes through all arms of China's maritime capabilities, whether that be the militia, the Coast Guard, or the PLAN, of aggressively enforcing what they believe is their waters. We saw another event last week around Half Moon Shoal. I think Half Moon Shoal is about 140 kilometers to the west of Philippines' Palawan Island, claimed by the Philippines and China, and it's about maybe 160 kilometers to the northeast of Second Thomas Shoal. And we saw, I think for the first time, well, certainly the first time that I've paid notice, we saw a PLAN vessel doing the harassment there. So it was a Chinese Houthi, which is really think of it like a corvette missile boat, pretty cool patterned one, to be honest. Some blue camouflage on it, harassing a Philippines resupply vessel that was attempting to resupply fishermen at Half Moon Shoal. So we're still seeing this continued aggression. Any kind of comments on South China Sea?
No, I'm necessary. I think it's just worth noting that the very different approaches that are being taken by the likes of Vietnam, Philippines, etc. But it's often can be misread or misconstrued as being sort of the Philippines are the only ones pushing back or the only ones really opposed to this kind of thing. Whereas actually, I think the Vietnamese in particular are very sort of firm in their assertion of their rights, but they just go about it in a rather different kind of a way. Now, whether or not incidents like this speak to a desire to actually try and publicise this a little bit more, it's always very, very difficult to tell. But it would be interesting if we see a more concerted effort by the Vietnamese government to shed light on what's going on out in their areas of the South China Sea.
Yeah, interestingly, I don't get the sense that they will. I mean, it seemed like in the reporting of this that they were actually quite reluctant to name China as the perpetrator of this until it just became so incredibly obvious that it was the Chinese. It wasn't the Chinese Coast Guard, but like a fisheries enforcement agency, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, it wasn't clear whether it was. Yeah, quite what arm of the Chinese, but it was clearly indicated it was government. So. Difficult to tell, but yes, it seems unlikely that there's going to be a Vietnamese transparency campaign. But it does feel like they are being increasingly, frankly, I think, assertive about their rights in this kind of area. And the Chinese are pushing everywhere, so it'll be very difficult to see how it's going to play out. But just something to keep the eye on.
Well, you know, with ASEAN centrality being a focus, maybe we'll see a resolution out of I think it's, for some reason it's reported as the 44th and 45th ASEAN Summit, so taking place this week at the ministerial level in Laos. Some controversy there because the US president isn't going. He's got a few things on his hands at the moment, you can imagine. But I don't think we'll see anything coming out of that has any influence or bearing on what's happening in the South China Sea, except maybe some condemnation of the level of aggression, but certainly not of any specific country.
No, I think hoping for too much out of an ASEAN summit is a fool's errand. Sticking kind of with the South China Sea, we've only got a little bit on capability today. Do you want to talk briefly about the new Philippines unit that's being stood up?
Yeah, look, certainly we have seen a trend kind of globally of countries establishing USV uncrewed surface vessel units. So there was some reporting. There was a major defense conference in the Philippines last week, and the commander of the Philippines Navy made an announcement that they would be establishing an uncrewed surface vessel unit, predominantly focused on intelligence, surveillance, and reporting. But the nature of that unit, how big it will be, and what capabilities it will operate is unclear. I do wonder if that's something that Australia might be choosing to support. We do have a lot of companies in Australia that build USVs, and we have been operating a number, including the Blue Bottle. So potentially that's something that we might be supporting. No reporting on that at this stage. What's your take on the new uncrewed surface vessel unit in the Philippines Navy?
So we were having a chat before we went live about the merits or otherwise of USVs for ISR. I think they do serve a really potentially useful purpose across a range of sort of areas, particularly because of their kind of endurance and persistence and all the attributes that we know about. The thing that does flag with me here is that of all the people to be doing this, the Philippines, it could quite easily get to raise some interesting kind of questions. What happens when the Philippines deploy these in contested areas? Do the Chinese seize them? What happens then? All sorts of other things that might stem from the use of these kind of vessels, all sorts of questions that we've been kind of talking about for a little while now and have vaguely come up in the Middle East, but I think could come really to the fore if these get used at any kind of scale in the South China Sea. So interesting, as you say, part of a much bigger global trend. I also think it fits with my view of the kind of broad direction for uncrewed is that I think ISR, small scale, relatively cheap, not flashy, is the right approach at the moment. So it's sort of that all seems to align to me, but I think that there could be some interesting questions further down the line if this does become used widespread.
Yeah, look, I think so too. I have some reservations about the utility of of USVs, uncrewed surface vessels, for surface ISR. I do, and I think that comes from many months spent trying to integrate USVs in Task Force 59 in the Middle East into Combined Maritime Forces operations. But I certainly agree with you with the persistence. My reservations, by the way, are just these are small vessels with a very limited kind of line of sight. But certainly you can see in some key strategic areas they might be effective. I think there is a much greater opportunity for underwater domain awareness with some of these USVs, potentially. And we have seen some reporting of some of these USVs trailing kind of small towed array systems, likely passive towed array systems. But I agree with you that there is something that is this threshold question of when you put a USV up threat, what does it do to the potential threshold of conflict? Does it lower the threshold? Because we do know from precedent that countries are more likely to interfere with them. We saw that in 2015 when China seized a US wave glider in the South China Sea. We saw that in, I nearly forget when, in 2022, last time I was in the Middle East, when Iran seized a sail drone very briefly in the Persian Gulf before it was returned, and also a sail drone very briefly in the Red Sea. And the sail drone is kind of a small USV, mainly used for surface ISR. So we certainly do see that countries are more likely to interfere with these in a way that they would not interfere with a crewed warship. And really the challenge is they're only beneficial if you have them in the numbers where if you lose one, it doesn't matter. And so there is a question there about whether they're talking about getting the Philippines Navy is talking about getting them at that scale. And then I think there is questions around And it would be good, probably, getting my legal hat on, to see the Philippines Navy make a kind of declaratory statement about how they view these capabilities. So there is a question, there's lots written on this. I've written a bit on it. Natalie Klein's written a bit on it about, are USVs vessels? Are they ships? And are they warships? And the warship question becomes important because it comes up to the question of, well, are they entitled to sovereign immunity? Do they have rights of self-defense, etc., etc.? The US has actually come out in a lot of their doctrine and said, yes, they do view USVs as warships. I personally think that's a bit of a stretch when it comes to the law, and some of the criteria under UNCLOS of defining warship does really imply a requirement to be crewed. It certainly requires a requirement to be commanded by a naval officer from a naval list. So I think lots more to come on this. We don't know what capabilities or how they'll be operating them, but this is a potential flashpoint. I think they would benefit from coming out and saying how they view these capabilities under international law.
Yeah, I think we've both been in furious agreement about that for some time, both from a legal perspective and a norms perspective. I also think it's interesting that if people are willing to do this to the US, how does this then affect in terms of what people are willing to do to other powers that might be using these, who perhaps don't necessarily have the same ability to respond or to escalate. So yeah, lots of interesting things to unpack there.
This is disappointing. We have agreed for most of this podcast, which probably makes it sound incredibly boring. We need to have more violent disagreements. We need to find something that we really do disagree on.
Well, yeah, we'll work on that one. We'll come back and talk more about the Red Sea.
Right, great. Fantastic.
In the meantime, you're going to be
Australian aircraft carriers. Let's talk about that as well.
Oh yes, absolutely. That's a surefire way for us to sink the RAN. Parking that one for now. You're going to be talking, doing the Did You Know today?
I did. Look, we're going to bring back the Did You Know. We haven't managed to do it every podcast, sometimes because we didn't know. But we talked about Exercise Bersama Lima. We mentioned that Exercise Bersama Lima is one of the 5-power defence agreement exercises. There are a series of them from a maritime perspective, from a joint perspective. Because there are army components of these exercises. There's traditionally Bersama Shield and Bersama Lima, both of which occur annually. Bersama Shield's normally a little bit smaller than Bersama Lima. But I guess the question is, what is the 5-power defence agreement? So the 5-power defence agreement is really a series of bilateral agreements established in 1971 between 5 different nations, which is the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Singapore. Originally, it was designed to provide security and cooperation in the wake of, Britain's withdrawal east of Suez. Don't know if I got my geography right on that one. But anyway, basically, when the UK reviewed their strategy, withdrew from the region, the FPDA was kind of established for Australia and New Zealand to step up and provide greater security and develop greater security relationships within the region, specifically with Singapore and Malaysia. And you've got to remember, around this time, it was very different to where we are now. We'd just come out of things like the confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia, of which the Royal Australian Navy and, in fact, the Royal New Zealand Navy sent ships to participate in. And there was some significant concern, and this is kind of the genesis for ASEAN, that there would be a lot more conflicts within Southeast Asia between nations that had been semi-recently decolonised. So under the 5-power defence agreement, or the FPDA for short, the 5 nations agreed to consult each other in the event of an armed attack against Malaysia or Singapore. It doesn't include a mutual defence obligation in any way. It's a consultation obligation. And it sets up regular joint military exercises, consultations, and cooperation to maintain regional security. Interestingly, it is one of the longest-standing multilateral defence agreements in the region, and its scope has expanded from traditional military exercises to include counter-terrorism, maritime security, and humanitarian assistance. And there is actually a standing FPDA headquarters, which is traditionally commanded by a Australian 2-star. Normally, I think it's a RAF 2-star, but I'd have to check my facts on that. So Royal Australian Air Force 2-star. The FPDA is quite unique because it's not a formal alliance, but it still enhances regional stability through regular exercises and multilateral cooperation. It has helped form closer ties between the countries in the region, and that goes to my point when we were talking about Bersama Lima, that certainly, look, Australia and Malaysia don't always have the closest of relationships, and certainly we've seen a number of Malaysian prime ministers make statements in the last 20, 30 years that have been critical of Australia. There is some questions about Malaysia's relationship with China, what that means for the relationship with Australia, and we certainly saw, in March this year, where Australia held an ASEAN Summit celebrating 50 years of being a dialogue partner between Australia and ASEAN. Australia was ASEAN's first dialogue partner. We saw some clear messaging from the Foreign Minister of Australia, Senator Wong, and the Foreign Minister equivalent from the Philippines about China's behaviour. And we saw in response the Malaysian Prime Minister, I think was in Australia at the time, come out and say, we have no problems with China. Of course, since then, we've seen a number of issues between Malaysia and China in the maritime domain that aren't necessarily publicly socialised. But I think when people talk about those issues, they actually forget that we still do have a degree of closeness, and we still, majority of ISR operations that Australian P8s conduct are conducted from Butterworth, based in Malaysia, which used to be an Australian base, it's a Malaysian base now. And we have a rifle company based up there. And of course, we have the FPDA. So on a military to military level, the relationship is closer than people necessarily assume. Comments on the FPDA? Bit of history there. Were you excited?
It's always good to be talking about a little bit of history and talking about the withdrawal from the east of Suez and all the implications that come with it. So, no, I think it's an important, if largely forgotten, part of the kind of the regional infrastructure. So, an excellent. Did you know?
Thank you.
I think on that note, that's all we have time for this week. So we will, as always, confirm that this week, as ever, Maritime matters. And we'll see you again, hopefully, to listen again next week. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Richard.